I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The idea of escaping the city, with its constant hum of traffic and fluorescent lights, to somewhere quiet and wild, had become almost an obsession. I had scouted a spot in the northern forest, a place that wasn't a designated campground. It was isolated, surrounded by dense trees, and near a small, slow-moving river that curved through a low valley. I wanted the kind of solitude that only comes from being far from roads and other people, where your footsteps and the rustle of leaves are the only sounds. I left the city early in the morning, with the air still carrying the chill of winter's end. The drive was long, the highways eventually giving way to narrow, winding roads lined with pines and oaks. The forest grew denser as I approached my destination, and by the time I parked the car at the trailhead, sunlight was filtering weakly through a canopy of old trees, casting long shadows on the ground. I checked my backpack for the 5th time, making sure I had everything: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, first aid kit, flashlight, extra batteries, a small hatchet, and a sturdy knife. I also brought a compact stove and some fire-starting materials, knowing that in a place this isolated, fire wasn't just for warmth, it was safety. The trail was overgrown, a narrow path barely distinguishable under fallen leaves and the occasional broken branch. It was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. The birds were mostly silent. The wind barely moved the treetops. Every step I took seemed louder than it should have been. I walked for hours, my legs straining under the weight of the pack, the uneven ground forcing me to watch every step. Occasionally, I would come across a small patch of wildflowers or the tracks of animals: deer, raccoon, and once the unmistakable large paw prints of a bear. My heart would always skip when I saw those prints, but I reminded myself I was careful, making plenty of noise, and not leaving food scattered around. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing near the river. The ground was relatively flat, with soft moss underfoot, and a few old pines offered natural windbreaks. I decided this would be my spot. I set up my tent, hammering the stakes into the damp earth, and cleared the area around the small fire pit I intended to use. I gathered dry wood from fallen branches, careful to avoid anything still green or wet. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon when I finally sat back, sweating from the work and feeling a deep satisfaction in being completely alone in such an untouched place. As evening approached, the forest seemed to shift. The shadows grew longer and darker, stretching in ways that made familiar shapes seem alien. The temperature dropped rapidly. The warmth of the day faded, replaced by a sharp chill that crept into my bones despite my jacket. I built a fire, watching the flames lick the wood, casting light and shadows across the clearing. I boiled water for dinner and ate a simple meal of rice and canned beans, the taste bland but comforting. I stayed near the fire, scanning the edges of the clearing with every flicker of flame, aware that I was entirely exposed once I left its warmth. Night fell fully, and with it, an oppressive darkness. My flashlight illuminated only a few feet beyond me. Everything else dissolved into black. The forest made noises that seemed exaggerated in the quiet. The crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant splash of water from the river. I kept thinking I heard other sounds. Footsteps, a low grunt. But each time I tensed, it turned out to be the wind or an animal moving. Still, my heart raced more often than it should have. Around midnight, the wind picked up. It wasn't a strong gust, just a constant shifting that made the trees moan. My fire, which I had hoped would last through the night, sputtered, sending sparks into the darkness. I added more wood, my hands shaking slightly from the cold and tension. Then I heard it clearly, a series of deliberate, heavy footsteps moving along the perimeter of the clearing. They were slow, steady, and not accompanied by any breaking of branches, as though whatever was there was careful. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I strained my eyes into the darkness beyond the firelight. The noise stopped as suddenly as it had started. My mind raced through possibilities. Wild animals, another hiker, someone who had followed the trail. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness, moving it slowly across the trees, but the beam revealed nothing. The forest was empty. I debated my options. Staying in the tent felt like a trap, but venturing out without knowing what I was dealing with seemed worse. I decided to wait, huddled near the fire, listening. The footsteps returned, this time from a different direction, circling closer. My fear became tangible, a physical pressure in my chest. I realized that I had never truly been alone in the woods. Not like this. The idea that someone could be there, watching me silently for hours, was unbearable. I grabbed my knife and hatchet, holding them close. My phone was in my pack, but there was no signal, and I hadn't told anyone where I was going. Something I now regretted. The footsteps stopped again. Then I heard a low, quiet grunt followed by a snapping branch, very close. My fire had burned down to embers, casting only dim light. I knew that staying near the fire was safer, but I also knew that I could not run blindly into the darkness without knowing what awaited. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. I stayed alert, my ears straining, until the first signs of dawn began to lighten the sky. The forest remained still. Whatever had been there seemed to have left. I felt a mix of relief and exhaustion, my body shaking from adrenaline and cold. I packed up quickly, leaving the tent and minimal gear behind, deciding not to risk another night in that clearing. I stayed close to the river, using it as a natural guide, and moved slowly but steadily along the bank, hoping to find a trail or any sign of human presence. Hours later, I stumbled onto a logging road, a faint, worn path barely wide enough for a vehicle. I followed it until I found my car, parked exactly where I had left it, the engine cold but intact. The relief was overwhelming. I drove back slowly, the city's familiar skyline appearing through the mist, its noise and lights no longer suffocating but strangely comforting. I realized I had survived something that was not a story for others to tell, but a lesson I would carry with me forever. The wilderness was beautiful and peaceful by day, but it demanded respect, awareness, and humility, and it could become terrifying in an instant if those qualities were absent. I never went back to that forest, and I never camped alone again. But that experience, the intense, raw fear of being truly vulnerable in a remote place, stayed with me. It taught me to prepare better, to anticipate danger, and to respect the subtle signs of the wild. I still hike and camp, but always with caution, always aware that isolation can make even the most beautiful place feel hostile, and that sometimes the most terrifying moments come not from ghosts or myths, but from reality itself. I had been planning the camping trip for months, meticulously checking every detail, from the weather forecast to the type of tent and sleeping bag I would take. The plan was simple. Head deep into the mountains, far from roads, cell signals, and anyone else who might ruin the peace of being completely alone in the wilderness. I had hiked these trails before, but this time I wanted to go further, to a remote spot near a small lake that few people ever reached. It promised isolation, silence, and a chance to disconnect completely from the noise of the world. I packed my car the night before the trip, making sure everything was organized. I had 2 backpacks, one with clothes, food, and basic survival tools, and the other with my camera gear and some extra emergency supplies. I even packed a small first aid kit, extra water purification tablets, a portable stove, and a compact folding saw in case I needed to cut wood for fire. I told myself that preparation would make the trip smooth, but I never imagined just how much it would test me. The drive up the mountain was longer than I expected. The road became dirtier and narrower as I climbed, winding through dense pine forests. By the time I parked my car near the last cleared area, the sun was already low, painting the sky orange and pink. I double-checked my packs, slung them over my shoulders, and started hiking along the narrow trail that led to the lake. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird call or the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. I felt alive, aware, and strangely calm as I walked deeper into the woods. The trail was rougher than I expected. Roots twisted underfoot, rocks jutted out of the soil, and at times I had to climb small slopes that made my legs burn. After a couple of hours, the sunlight had faded, and shadows stretched long and dark across the trail. I reached a small clearing near the lake just as twilight began to settle. The water reflected the last light of the sun, smooth and still, surrounded by thick forest on all sides. I knew it was perfect for camping, isolated enough that I might not see anyone else for days. I set down my packs, took out the tent, and began the slow process of assembling it. The air was cooling rapidly, and I could feel the moisture from the nearby water clinging to my clothes. I moved quickly, my fingers stiffening as the temperature dropped. By the time the tent was set up, it was nearly dark. I collected dry wood from the surrounding area, careful to avoid damp logs, and started a small fire using matches and kindling. The fire crackled to life, throwing warm light against the shadows of the trees. I unpacked my small stove and prepared a simple meal of canned beans and rice, grateful for the heat and the comfort of food after the long hike. After eating, I cleaned my small cooking area, stored my food in a bear-proof container, and crawled into my sleeping bag inside the tent. The sounds of the forest surrounded me. The gentle lapping of the lake, the distant call of an owl, and the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. I felt a sense of isolation that was both thrilling and a little unnerving. That first night, I slept relatively well, although every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves caused me to tense up. I told myself it was just animals moving, that nothing could reach me here in this remote spot. By morning, the sun filtered weakly through the tall trees, painting everything in soft gold. I brewed coffee over the small stove, listening to the water boil and watching the lake shimmer in the early light. I felt peaceful, a rare feeling in my busy life. I spent the next day exploring the area, moving along the shoreline, checking the terrain, and marking paths in my mind. The forest was thick, the air damp but clean, filled with the scent of pine and earth. Occasionally, I saw deer tracks near the water, some small birds flitting between the branches. I was careful not to disturb anything, savoring the quiet. That evening, I made a slightly larger fire, cooked a proper meal, and settled in for the night, feeling a growing sense of respect for the isolation. But the trouble began on the second night. I had been sleeping lightly, but around 2 a.m., a noise woke me. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling through the trees, but then I heard it again. A sharp crack, like a branch snapping close to my tent. My heart jumped, and I froze, listening intently. The sound came again, this time followed by a soft, deliberate thud, as if someone or something was walking through the forest. I told myself it was a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the pace of the sound was steady, methodical, not like an animal moving. My stomach tightened, and I remained still in my sleeping bag, trying not to make a sound. The thuds stopped for a moment, then resumed, closer this time. My mind raced. I had my knife in the tent, and my fire was still burning outside, though barely. I thought about leaving, running to my car, but it was too far, too dark. My only option was to wait and stay quiet. The sounds moved around the perimeter of the tent, circling, making me feel trapped. Every instinct screamed at me to stay alert, to watch, but there was nothing I could see through the tent's fabric. The wind carried a faint smell of smoke, and I realized with dread that the fire might draw attention. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, it was impossible to tell, and finally the sounds receded into the distance. I didn't sleep again that night, lying awake until dawn, listening to the forest resume its normal noises. When light finally came, I peeked outside the tent. The campsite was untouched, the fire reduced to glowing embers. Branches near the edge of the clearing were broken, trampled into the ground, as if someone or something had walked through cautiously, observing. My pulse was still high, and I felt a cold knot of fear in my stomach. The next day, I decided to stay alert but continue my plan. I explored further along the trail, noting the signs of large footprints near the lake. They were human, definitely adult, but I didn't see anyone. I collected extra firewood, set traps for small animals for food in case I had to stay longer, and kept my knife and hatchet within reach. Every sound made me jump. Birds taking flight, twigs breaking, even my own footsteps on the forest floor. That evening, I decided not to light the fire fully. I built a small line of embers to maintain some warmth, but kept it low to avoid drawing attention. Darkness fell faster than I expected, swallowing the forest in a thick blackness that made my eyes ache. Around 10 p.m., I heard it again, the crack of a branch nearby, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps. This time, I could see shadows moving along the edge of the clearing outside my tent. My mind raced. Whoever or whatever was out there, they were aware of me. I stayed silent, lying flat in my sleeping bag, my knife gripped tightly in one hand. Hours dragged. The sounds circled, stopping at points, then resuming. At one point, I caught a glimpse of a shadow behind a tree, tall, human-shaped. My throat tightened, and I realized with growing horror that this was someone watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. My training, my preparation, my calm all struggled to hold together under the pressure. I remembered survival advice. Stay calm, stay low, avoid confrontation. If I could just last until dawn, I might get a chance to escape. Morning never felt so good. The first rays of sunlight burned through the trees, and I cautiously peeked outside. There was no one. The footprints from the night before were still there, leading into the forest, but the person had left. I packed quickly, leaving minimal traces of my campsite. I made my way along the trail, moving faster than I had in days. My senses were on high alert. Every sound, every shadow made me tense, but I kept going, determined not to stop until I reached my car. By late afternoon, exhausted but relieved, I finally emerged from the dense forest to the dirt road where I had parked. My car was untouched, just as I left it. I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove down the mountain as quickly as the road allowed. My hands were shaking, and I realized I hadn't breathed properly for hours. I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear, knowing I had been watched and that I had survived purely by staying calm and alert. Once home, I filed a report with the local ranger station, describing the footprints and the signs of someone following me. They told me it was likely someone who had been hiding in the woods, possibly a poacher or someone living off the grid. I never found out who it was, but the experience stayed with me. I went back to camping eventually, but never alone, and never without letting someone know my exact location. That trip taught me something important. No matter how prepared you are, the wilderness is unpredictable, and human threats can be just as dangerous as wild animals. I still dream about that night sometimes. The shadows, the footsteps circling my tent, the feeling of being hunted and helpless. But I also remember the relief of seeing the sunlight break through the trees, the feeling of my feet finally on solid, familiar ground, and the knowledge that I had survived purely through awareness and caution. It was a terrifying experience, but I made it out alive, and I had learned a lesson I would never forget. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months, drawn to the idea of leaving the noise of the city behind, leaving behind schedules, responsibilities, and even the faint hum of electronics that seemed to follow me everywhere. I wanted isolation, and I wanted it deep in the wilderness, somewhere that didn't even have cell service, where I would be forced to rely entirely on my own instincts and preparation. The spot I chose was a remote stretch of forest about a 3-hour drive from the nearest small town, a place marked on old topographic maps as Bear Creek Ridge, a narrow valley flanked by steep slopes, dense woods, and a meandering stream that promised fresh water. The more I read about it, the less it seemed to have been touched by modern visitors. That was exactly why I wanted to go. I arrived mid-afternoon, after navigating winding gravel roads and then a rough forest trail that rattled my car to its core. My pack was heavy, loaded with all the necessities: tent, sleeping bag, stove, enough food for 3 days, water filtration system, first aid kit, flashlight, extra batteries, and tools. I had tried to think of everything that might go wrong. I should have known that the wilderness has a way of revealing things you didn't even know you forgot to prepare for. The moment I stepped out of my car, the air felt different. It was cooler, crisper, and smelled of earth and damp leaves. The sun was starting its slow descent, scattering streaks of golden light through the thick trees. I began hiking the trail toward the site I had scouted on the map. The forest was alive with the usual sounds: birds calling to one another, the whisper of leaves, the occasional crack of a branch under the weight of some unseen animal. The trail was rough, and soon my legs were burning from the climb, but the thought of solitude pushed me onward. I finally found a clearing near the stream, just large enough for my tent, sheltered by a ridge on one side and a stand of pines on the other. It was perfect, or so I thought. I set up my tent as the sun sank below the horizon, leaving behind a soft twilight that quickly gave way to darkness. The stream babbled gently nearby, a sound that was comforting at first, until I noticed that the night was unusually quiet in every other way. The usual nocturnal sounds, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals, seemed muted or absent. I chalked it up to being a remote place. Perhaps the wildlife was shy. I made a small fire, cooked my meal, and sat quietly, listening to the stream. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, the sky was completely dark, scattered with stars that seemed brighter than I had ever seen in the city. The first night passed without incident, though I woke more than once to the sound of snapping twigs or the rustling of leaves just beyond the reach of my flashlight. Each time, I reminded myself that the forest was full of animals, nothing more. By morning, a mist hung over the valley, softening the outline of trees and turning the stream into a silver ribbon. I ate breakfast, packed my small stove and supplies, and decided to follow the stream upstream, hoping to explore a waterfall I had seen marked on the map. The hike was tougher than I had anticipated. The terrain was steep and slippery in places, and the thick undergrowth slowed my pace. After a few hours, I came to a point where the trail disappeared altogether. The stream carved a narrow canyon here, the bank steep and lined with slippery rocks. I scrambled along the edge, careful to keep my footing, listening to the roar of the waterfall ahead. That was when I first felt it. A subtle unease that prickled along the back of my neck, the kind you get when you sense something is off, even if you can't see it. The forest seemed to hold its breath around me. I shrugged it off, blaming fatigue, but as I approached the waterfall, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. There were footprints in the mud along the bank. Large, heavy prints, not human, not quite like a bear. They were too elongated to be a deer, too wide to be a fox, and the claw marks were shallow but distinct. I crouched, studying them. They led both upstream and back toward the forest, as though the creature had been pacing, waiting. My pulse quickened. I knew the woods were home to bears, yes, and bears could be dangerous, but I had taken precautions. Bear spray, proper storage of food, and loud noises when moving. Yet these tracks didn't feel ordinary. There was a precision to them, a regularity that made my skin crawl. I decided not to linger near the waterfall. I retraced my steps carefully, keeping an eye on the tracks. As I descended, I began to notice small signs that something, or someone, was following me. A broken branch here, a disturbed patch of moss there. My mind tried to reason it away. A deer, a raccoon, maybe even a forest worker. But a small part of me refused to be calmed. By the time I reached my camp, the unease had settled into a deep, gnawing dread. The night fell slowly. I built my fire higher than usual, scanning the darkness beyond the circle of light. I ate little, my appetite gone. Every rustle of leaves, every distant snap of a branch made me jump. I stayed awake for hours, flashlight in hand, rotating it slowly across the trees. Nothing appeared, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. My mind raced, imagining all kinds of scenarios, some logical, some absurd. I told myself I would leave first thing in the morning, follow the trail back to my car, and never return. Then, in the middle of the night, the first sound came. A low, wet growl, far enough away that it was hard to pinpoint, but close enough that it made the hair on my arms stand up. I froze, straining to hear over the roar of the stream and the crackle of the fire. Another growl, closer this time, followed by the sound of something moving through the underbrush, deliberate, heavy, careful. I grabbed my bear spray and flashlight, trying to peer into the darkness. The firelight did little to help. Shadows clung to the edges of the clearing. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by occasional rustling, until I realized the growling had stopped. Exhausted, I tried to sleep in short bursts, waking frequently, every time imagining eyes glowing in the darkness. By the morning, my nerves were frayed. I ate a meager breakfast, packed my gear, and began the trek back, taking a different path to avoid any confrontation near the stream. The hike down the ridge was exhausting. My legs ached, and my pack felt heavier than ever. As I neared the car, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. The dirt road leading to my vehicle was disturbed, tire marks fresh, overlapping with deep, wide tracks. Someone or something had been there while I was out exploring. My pulse quickened. I scanned the trees and the undergrowth. No one was in sight, but the realization hit me. I was not alone in this forest. Whoever or whatever had been there, they had been watching me. My instincts screamed at me to move quickly, but I forced myself to remain calm, to plan my exit carefully. I loaded my pack into the trunk of the car and double-checked that all doors were locked. The engine roared to life, the sound somehow comforting in the emptiness. I started down the gravel road slowly, scanning the trees on both sides. Then I saw it, barely visible in the early morning light. A figure, crouched low near the tree line, watching me. Not an animal, not a bear, person. My heart hammered in my chest. I pressed the accelerator, my hands gripping the wheel, and kept my eyes on the road. The figure didn't move at first, then slowly disappeared into the trees. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway. Every sense was alert, every nerve taut. I called the local ranger station to report what I had seen. They asked questions I couldn't fully answer, warning me that others had reported suspicious activity in that area. Strangers watching campers, sometimes interfering with equipment, leaving signs to unsettle people. They advised me to file a report, which I did, and to avoid the area in the future. Driving back, I replayed the events over and over in my mind. The forest had been beautiful, isolated, and silent in a way I had craved, but the experience had been a harsh reminder that solitude comes with risks. Wildlife was one thing, humans with unknown intentions were another. When I returned home, I unpacked slowly, examining every item for tampering. Nothing had been touched, thankfully, but the feeling of being hunted lingered in my mind. I eventually learned that someone had been living illegally in that part of the forest, using the isolation to avoid detection, and they had been known to monitor hikers and campers, sometimes threatening them from the shadows. I was lucky. Nothing had happened beyond the fear and the tension of being watched. The experience left me cautious but wiser. I invested in better safety equipment, and I learned the value of informing someone of your route in remote areas. I never returned to Bear Creek Ridge. The memory stayed with me for years, a reminder that the wilderness is not always empty, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing out there isn't a bear, or a cliff, or the river, but a human, patient, silent, and unseen. The sense of dread I felt that night never fully left me, but it also taught me respect for preparation, awareness, and caution. I still camp, still hike, but I do it with a careful eye, knowing that the forest can be breathtakingly beautiful, but also unforgiving, and that human presence can turn any serene place into a place of fear in an instant. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. I needed a break from the city, from the constant noise, the endless obligations, and the people whose lives seemed to run on autopilot. I wanted the quiet of the wilderness, the solitude of being completely alone in a forest I had never been to before. I had scouted a remote area on a map, a small clearing in the foothills of a national forest, far from roads, trails, or any human habitation. My friends had called me crazy, telling me it wasn't safe, but I had a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold weather, enough food for a week, and a survival kit that included a small hatchet, a first aid kit, a fire starter, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I convinced myself that I was prepared for anything. The drive to the trailhead was long and uneventful, winding through narrow roads flanked by tall, dense pine forests. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the hills as I parked my car, a small, dusty path leading deeper into the forest. I double-checked my gear, tightened the straps on my backpack, and started walking. The first hour was easy. The path was clear, the air smelled fresh and damp, and I could hear birds chirping in the fading light. But as I walked further, the trail became less defined, overgrown with fallen branches and thick underbrush. The sunlight disappeared quickly behind the canopy, leaving me in the dim green glow of the forest. I told myself this was part of the adventure. By the time I reached the clearing I had chosen, night had fallen completely. I could barely make out the outlines of the surrounding trees, their shadows stretching like long, dark fingers into the center of the clearing. I set up my tent slowly, methodically checking each step, making sure it was secured to the ground. The silence was complete except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I gathered some dry branches and twigs to make a small fire, using my fire starter to get it going. The flames crackled to life, casting flickering light over the clearing, illuminating the rough contours of tree trunks and the uneven ground. I sat by the fire for a long time, eating a simple meal of canned beans and crackers. The air was cool, sharp, and smelled of pine and earth. Night sounds surrounded me. Distant owl calls, the chirping of crickets, the occasional rustle that could have been a small animal moving through the underbrush. I felt a sense of satisfaction, being here alone, away from everything familiar, surrounded by nature in its raw, untamed form. I went to sleep in my tent feeling exhausted but content. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a faint noise. At first, I thought it was the wind or a branch falling in the forest, but then I realized it was something else. A subtle, scraping sound coming from the edge of the clearing. My heart rate increased. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, nothing dangerous, nothing to worry about. But the sound continued, slow and deliberate, like something dragging over the forest floor. I unzipped my tent carefully, peering out. The fire had burned low, just enough to cast shadows on the trees around me. I could make out vague shapes moving at the edge of the light, shapes that were too upright, too deliberate to be deer. I froze, my mind racing through possible scenarios. A bear? Maybe, but bears usually made noise when approaching, huffing, or breaking branches. This was quieter, more calculated. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the treeline. The beam caught a human figure, standing just beyond the firelight. I could barely make out the outline, but it was tall, thin, and completely still. My stomach dropped. I had chosen this spot because it was isolated, but now I realized that maybe someone had followed the trail, someone who had seen me arrive. I didn't make a sound. I kept the flashlight steady, the beam cutting across the dark figure. It didn't move. Then, slowly, it began to step closer. Each movement deliberate, almost silent, as if it knew exactly how to avoid making noise. I dropped the flashlight slightly, my hands trembling. My mind raced. I could try to run, but the forest was dark and uneven. My car was far away, and the trail back was long and treacherous in the dark. I could yell, but there was no one to hear me. I reached for my hatchet, the small weight in my hand offering a tiny sense of reassurance. The figure moved closer, stopping at the edge of the firelight. I could see now that it was wearing dark clothing, blending into the shadows. Its face was obscured, hidden by a hood or a hat, and it carried a long, thin object slung across its back. Maybe a stick, maybe a weapon. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would give me away, but the figure didn't react. I realized that if it wanted to harm me, it could have done so already. It seemed to be assessing, studying, calculating. I stayed perfectly still, breathing slowly, trying to appear smaller, less noticeable. The minutes dragged on. Finally, the figure retreated into the darkness, disappearing into the forest with the same silent deliberation it had shown when approaching. I waited a long time after until the rustling faded completely before I dared to move. I extinguished the fire completely, crawling back into my tent, shaking uncontrollably. Sleep was impossible. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening to every sound, jumping at every snap of a branch, every distant cry of an animal. The next morning, I packed up slowly, checking and rechecking my gear. My appetite was gone, replaced by a constant tension that made every movement feel heavy. I left the clearing, moving carefully, watching the trees around me. I avoided the obvious trail, taking a longer, less obvious route, trying to put as much distance between myself and the clearing as possible. The forest seemed different in the daylight, less threatening, but every shadow, every rustle still made me jump. By mid-afternoon, I reached a small stream. I drank some water, careful to filter it, and rested briefly, trying to calm myself. I realized that I had underestimated the dangers of being completely alone. The forest was not inherently evil, but it was unpredictable, and people who sought isolation could be both dangerous and desperate. I followed the stream downhill, hoping it would lead me to a road or a trail. The sun was sinking low in the sky again, casting long shadows over the water. Eventually, I reached a gravel road. Relief flooded me, but I stayed alert, moving along the side of the road, watching for any signs of movement in the trees. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a small town in the distance. My pace quickened, almost running now, my body fueled by adrenaline and fear. When I finally reached the first house, I knocked on the door until someone came out. They looked surprised, concerned, and I explained briefly that I had been camping alone and had a frightening encounter. They called the local authorities, who drove me back to my car the next day. The experience left me shaken. I realized that my preparation, while thorough for survival, had not accounted for human threats. I had trusted the wilderness, but not the people who also moved through it. I learned to respect isolation, to understand that the forest is neutral, but it can amplify danger when other humans are involved. Months later, I returned to the same area, but this time during the day with friends, sticking to well-traveled trails. I found my clearing again. The tent was gone, the ground disturbed, the signs of someone else's presence obvious. It had been used recently, maybe even the night I was there. I took note of the tracks, careful to observe, and we set up a safe distance away from the spot. The fear I had felt that night remained with me, but this time, it was tempered by caution and experience. The lesson stayed with me long after. I still camp alone occasionally, but I never take isolation for granted. Never assume that the forest's only danger is the elements or wild animals. People can be unpredictable, and being alone makes you vulnerable in ways that nothing else does. I carry a whistle now, a small personal alarm, and I always let someone know exactly where I will be and when I plan to return. I learned to trust my instincts, to notice the subtle signs of someone else's presence, and to move carefully, even when the forest seems quiet and welcoming. That night in the clearing changed the way I approach solitude. I realized that fear is not always about what you imagine. It is about what is real, what could happen, and how unprepared you are for it. I left the forest with more than relief. I left with vigilance, awareness, and a deep respect for the unknown movements of others in places we think are safe. Even now, years later, I remember that night vividly. The darkness pressing in, the sound of deliberate footsteps, the feeling of being watched. And every time I plan another trip into the wilderness, that memory guides me, keeping me careful, keeping me alive. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. I needed the break, a complete escape from the constant noise and pressure of work and life. I had grown tired of cities, their endless traffic, the bright lights that never let me sleep properly, and the constant weight of obligations that felt heavier every day. The idea of being alone in the woods, miles from anyone else, with nothing but my backpack, a tent, and a small fire, sounded like a dream. I wanted to push myself to be self-reliant, and to feel the quiet so deeply that I could hear my own thoughts clearly. I didn't just want a short getaway. I wanted something long enough that I could forget, even briefly, the world I usually inhabited. I chose a forest that was known but not overly popular, a few hours' drive from the nearest town. It had trails, a small lake, and a few old campsites. From what I had researched, it was remote enough that there would be very few people around, but not so wild that it would be dangerous for someone alone. I packed carefully, checking and double-checking my gear. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights, a small stove, food for several days, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, a flashlight, a headlamp, extra batteries, a map, a compass, and a multi-tool. I even packed extra rope and some paracord just in case. My phone, though mostly useless in the middle of the forest, was fully charged. I felt prepared. I had read guides, watched videos, and planned every day of the trip in detail. The drive to the forest was uneventful. The sun was low in the sky when I parked at the trailhead, its golden light spilling over the tops of the trees. I loaded my backpack, feeling its weight settle against my shoulders, and started the hike. First, everything was easy. The trail was well marked, the air smelled of pine and wet soil, and the sounds of birds and insects filled the forest. I felt alive. My pace was steady, careful because my pack was heavy, but not slow. Every few minutes, I stopped to look around, to listen. I wanted to imprint the forest in my mind before night came. After a few hours, I reached the area where I had planned to camp. It was a small clearing near the edge of a shallow stream. The spot was perfect. I could hear the water trickling over rocks, and the trees formed a natural barrier from the rest of the forest, giving a sense of privacy. I set up my tent, secured it with stakes, and laid out my sleeping bag. The sun was just dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows and bathing the clearing in orange light. I built a small fire, stacking the wood carefully so it would burn steadily through the night. The crackling flames cast dancing shadows on the trees, and the smell of smoke mixed with the earthy scent of the forest. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, some rice and canned beans, and ate slowly, savoring the silence and the solitude. Night fell quickly. The forest darkened, and the shadows deepened. The temperature dropped, and I zipped up my sleeping bag tightly, letting the warmth of the fire reach me for as long as I could. I had expected the forest to be peaceful, but as darkness settled, a new tension began to seep into the air. The sounds were different now. The wind whispered through the trees, creating shapes in the darkness that seemed alive. Small animals rustled in the underbrush, and somewhere far off, a branch snapped sharply. I felt a subtle unease, but I reminded myself that this was normal, that the forest was full of life, and that I was prepared. I went to sleep that first night with the fire still burning low, confident that I was safe. But around midnight I woke. The wind had picked up, shaking the tent slightly, and the smell of smoke had faded. I could hear movement outside, something heavy moving through the brush near the stream. I held my breath, trying to identify the sound. It wasn't like the small rustling of deer or rabbits. It was slower, deliberate. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear. The noise stopped after a few minutes, and I thought I must have imagined it. But I didn't sleep well after that, lying awake listening to the night and the forest around me. Every snap of a twig, every rustle made me tense, heart racing. The next day, I tried to shake off the unease. I explored the nearby area, walked along the stream, and marked my path with small pieces of cloth tied to branches so I wouldn't get lost. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, with sunlight filtering through the canopy, illuminating moss-covered rocks and fallen leaves. Birds called to each other, and I saw deer grazing in the distance. I collected more firewood and made sure I had enough water. Still, a nagging thought lingered in my mind. I wasn't entirely alone. Something felt off. That night, I double-checked my firewood, secured the tent, and stayed alert. Around 11 p.m., the same sound returned, heavy movement in the brush, now closer. I froze, listening carefully. This time, it wasn't just one movement. There were multiple sounds, like something large circling my campsite. My first thought was that it was a bear. I had read about bears in this forest, but I hadn't seen any during the day. I tried to remain calm, reminding myself that I had bear spray in my pack. I kept the flashlight close and watched the shadows outside. The noises continued for nearly an hour, circling the clearing. Every once in a while, I thought I saw something moving between the trees, just at the edge of the firelight. Eventually, the noises stopped. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn, too tense to sleep. I had a decision to make. I could leave, but that would mean abandoning the trip I had been planning for months. I decided to stay, but I resolved to be extra careful, to keep the fire going through the night, and to set up some makeshift alarms using rope and cans I had in my pack. The following days were a tense routine. I spent daylight hours exploring, gathering supplies, and reinforcing my campsite. I observed the forest carefully, noting signs of wildlife, and avoided areas that seemed too dense or dangerous. Each night, the same unsettling sounds returned. At first, I assumed it was animals. Bears, deer, maybe wild boar, but as the days went on, I noticed that the tracks around my campsite didn't match typical animal footprints. They were larger, irregular, and seemed too heavy for deer or bears in some areas. That realization made my stomach tighten. By the fourth night, the tension had escalated. I slept very little, constantly waking at every sound. Around 1 a.m., I heard the noises again. Something large moving slowly around my campsite, pausing sometimes as if observing me. I could hear the crunch of leaves and the occasional snap of a branch. My mind raced. I thought about the possibility of another human in the forest, someone or some people trespassing. The thought made me both alert and terrified. I remembered reading articles about hikers being attacked by other hikers or hunters in remote areas. The fear was real, not imagined. I prepared myself, keeping my flashlight and a long branch nearby, ready to defend myself if needed. The fifth day, I decided to change my strategy. I knew staying in the same place made me vulnerable. I packed up my campsite quietly and left the trail I had been following. I moved along the stream, choosing less obvious paths and keeping my pack light. I didn't make a fire that night, fearing it could attract attention. Instead, I found a hidden spot behind a thick cluster of trees and settled in the darkness. I ate cold food from my pack and tried to sleep in short bursts. Every noise seemed amplified. I heard distant footsteps, the sound of something heavy moving, and occasionally voices too faint to understand. The forest no longer felt peaceful, felt alive in a threatening way. On the sixth day, I finally caught a clear glimpse of movement. From a distance, through a break in the trees, I saw a figure, a human figure, moving deliberately but quietly. It was far enough that I couldn't make out details, but I could tell it wasn't an animal. My heart sank. I realized then that all the nights of noises weren't wildlife. Someone had been moving around my campsite, observing me, possibly following me. I felt exposed, vulnerable, but I also knew that panicking would make me careless. I retreated silently, taking an indirect path toward the nearest ranger station I had marked on my map. I kept to dense areas, avoiding open clearings, moving slowly and carefully. That day, I avoided any unnecessary movement, and by nightfall, I reached a small creek that led toward a service road. I decided to rest near the creek but kept my pack ready, my eyes scanning constantly. The forest felt silent in comparison to previous nights, but the tension remained. I slept in short bursts, only resting when I felt safe enough. On the seventh day, I finally reached the ranger station. I emerged from the trees carefully, cautious of anyone following me. The station was empty, but I could see footprints in the dirt nearby. I entered, locked the door, and used the radio to call for help. By the next morning, a ranger arrived. I explained everything I had seen, the tracks, the noises, the figure, and they took me seriously. The ranger assured me that they would investigate the area. They explained that while most people in the forest were hikers or hunters, there had been reports of illegal campers and individuals who would follow others for reasons unknown. I felt a mixture of relief and lingering unease. I had survived by staying alert, by trusting my instincts, and by moving cautiously. Looking back, the trip had been far more intense than I ever imagined. The solitude I sought turned into a test of awareness and endurance. I learned how quickly peace can shift into danger, how important preparation is, and how much trust you must place in your instincts. I had come into the forest seeking quiet and reflection, but I left with a new understanding of how unpredictable and raw the wilderness can be, especially when humans are involved. My story ended safely, but the memory of those nights, the sounds, and the figure lurking just beyond the light stayed with me for years. I had survived, and I had learned something invaluable. In the forest, the most dangerous thing isn't always nature. It can be other people. I had planned the camping trip for weeks, meticulously preparing every little thing I thought I might need. I wanted it to be perfect, a true escape from the constant noise of daily life, a break from work and responsibilities, a chance to breathe without any interruptions. The thought of being surrounded by nothing but trees, rocks, and the distant sound of water was comforting. I wanted isolation, but I also wanted to be safe, so I chose a well-known area in the forest, a place I had been to before in the daytime with friends. This time, however, I was going alone. The drive there was long but quiet, the roads winding and narrow, framed by thick forest on either side. My car's engine hummed along steadily as I passed small streams, abandoned cabins, and occasional signs warning about bears, though I doubted I would encounter any. The weather was cool but dry, perfect for camping, and the sun shone through gaps in the trees, scattering light across the road in shifting patterns. I arrived at the trailhead around mid-afternoon, the parking area nearly empty except for one other car in the distance. I checked my gear carefully before starting the hike. I had packed a tent, sleeping bag, extra clothes, a small stove, plenty of food, a first aid kit, and all the necessary tools for survival. I also carried a heavy-duty flashlight, a backup lighter, and extra batteries. I wanted to be ready for anything, but I had no idea what I was about to face. The hike began easily enough. The trail was clear, marked, and familiar, winding through dense trees and over uneven ground. The sound of leaves crunching under my boots, the distant babble of a stream, and the occasional chirping of birds were all I heard. Felt peaceful. I moved deliberately, stopping occasionally to take photos of unusual rocks or twisted tree trunks. My pack was heavy, but manageable. I enjoyed the solitude, thinking about how rarely I had a chance to be completely alone. After a few hours, I reached a clearing where I intended to set up camp. It was an open area, slightly elevated, giving a view of the surrounding forest. I could hear the stream nearby, a soothing background noise that made the place feel almost perfect. I picked a spot that seemed flat enough for the tent, cleared away leaves and branches, and began to set it up. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. As I worked, I noticed small signs that something might be nearby. Broken branches, scuff marks on the ground, and faint tracks that weren't mine. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, deer or other wildlife, but there was a nagging sense of awareness, a feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. I shrugged it off, focusing on getting the tent set up before darkness fell completely. By the time I finished, the sun had disappeared behind the trees. The sky turned a dull orange and then purple, fading to dark. I built a small fire using the kindling I had collected, making sure it was contained within a ring of stones I had arranged carefully. The warmth and light from the fire made the clearing feel safer, and I sat nearby eating a simple meal of canned beans and bread. I listened to the forest around me, the occasional snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, and the steady flow of the stream. After eating, I decided to explore a little before bed. I didn't go far, just a few hundred feet along the trail, keeping the fire in sight. The forest was darker than I expected, the canopy blocking much of the fading light. Shadows seemed to move with the wind, making familiar shapes look strange. My heart rate increased slightly, not from fear exactly, but from heightened awareness. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that I was experienced, that I knew how to navigate forests at night. When I returned to the camp, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The area around my tent looked slightly disturbed. Small footprints led away from the clearing toward the trees, and some of the underbrush appeared pressed down as if someone or something had moved through it. My mind raced, thinking of all the possible explanations. Animals, wind, my imagination. But something felt off. The footprints were too deliberate, too consistent in size and spacing to be random. I decided to check my surroundings thoroughly. I circled the clearing, shining my flashlight into the darkness. I saw nothing except trees and shadows. The tracks stopped at the edge of the forest, leading into thick underbrush where visibility was nearly zero. My logical mind told me it could be a hiker who had passed by, but a part of me felt uneasy, a cold knot forming in my chest. I returned to the tent and tried to sleep, but it was impossible. Every small sound made me tense. A branch breaking, the rustle of leaves, even the soft hum of insects. I lay awake, eyes wide, straining to catch any movement. Around midnight, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps, deliberate and steady, coming from the direction of the trail. They stopped briefly, then continued toward my camp. I stayed as still as possible, heart hammering, listening. The sounds of my own breathing seemed deafening. I realized that the fire I had left burning was attracting attention. I considered putting it out, but the thought of moving in complete darkness, alone, terrified me more. I kept quiet, trying to make myself seem invisible, hoping that whoever or whatever it was would pass by. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the clearing, just out of the light, and then, after a long pause, I heard something else. A low, intentional snapping of a branch, closer this time. I knew I had to act. I grabbed my flashlight and my small folding knife, the only defense I had. The figure, or creature, remained in the shadows. I couldn't see it clearly, but the outline was humanoid. My first thought was to stay calm and wait for morning, but the fear of being discovered and unarmed made that impossible. I considered running to my car, but I had left it far down the trail, and I didn't want to risk encountering it in the dark. I remembered a small ridge behind the clearing that could offer some cover and higher ground. I carefully backed toward it, keeping my movements slow and deliberate, not wanting to draw attention. The ground was uneven, and my flashlight beam revealed roots and rocks that could trip me. I stumbled once but recovered quickly, keeping my focus on the shadows where I thought the figure might be. Once I reached the ridge, I crouched down, trying to make myself as small as possible. I kept the flashlight off, relying on my night vision and hearing. The footsteps moved around the clearing, circling, pausing, then moving again. It was like a predator assessing its prey. I felt my stomach knot with fear, adrenaline sharpening my senses. I could hear breathing, human, definitely human. Whoever it was, they were careful, calculating. Hours seemed to pass like this. I stayed hidden on the ridge, my eyes adjusting to the darkness, listening to every sound. Occasionally, the figure would move closer, then retreat. It was like a twisted game, a test of who would make a mistake first. My mind replayed every horror story I had ever heard, every survival tip I had ever read. I reminded myself to stay calm, to keep track of my surroundings, to preserve energy. When the first light of dawn finally broke, I could see the figure more clearly. They were gone. No tracks, no sign, nothing. I didn't understand how they had disappeared so completely. I cautiously returned to my campsite. The tent was untouched, the fire had died, and the clearing looked normal, almost as if nothing had happened. I packed up quickly, adrenaline still pumping, and began the hike back to my car. The hike back was tense but uneventful. I kept my eyes on the forest edges, expecting to see movement, but nothing appeared. By the time I reached the parking lot, my hands were shaking and I was exhausted. The other car was gone, and I realized I had been completely alone in that forest with an unknown presence that had stayed hidden until the morning. When I drove away, I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. I had survived, and that survival depended on staying calm, thinking clearly, and making calculated choices. I knew that I had been lucky. Lucky that the figure didn't attack, lucky that I had found cover, lucky that I had a route to safety. The experience left me shaken but also more aware, more cautious. I learned that nature is unpredictable, not just in weather or wildlife, but in the people who move through it. Some dangers are hidden, and some are silent, but they are very real. I never returned to that clearing, but I kept thinking about it, the way the shadows moved, the way the forest held secrets I couldn't see. I started to carry more equipment on future trips, including a stronger flashlight, a whistle, and even a small flare gun. I planned my hikes with greater care, choosing routes that offered more visibility and escape options. Over time, I realized that camping alone is not just a test of endurance but of awareness, of understanding that the forest, though beautiful, is not entirely safe. Years later, I shared the story with a friend who also camped regularly. They didn't dismiss it or laugh. They nodded, knowing exactly what I meant. It wasn't a ghost story, a fantasy, or a tale meant to scare for entertainment. It was real. Real enough that I could still feel the tension in my chest, the cold grip of fear, and the relief of survival. That experience stayed with me, a constant reminder that being prepared, observant, and cautious is the difference between walking away or becoming another story whispered about in the forest. From that day on, I never underestimated the quiet dangers of being alone in the wild. I continued camping, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends, but always aware, always ready. And though the forest never gave me another encounter like that, I knew it could happen again, anywhere, at any time. The lesson was simple but profound. Vigilance is survival, and fear, when controlled, can be the greatest tool of all. It was late summer, the kind of summer where the days still burn bright and the nights carry a sharp chill. I had been planning this trip for months, waiting for the chance to escape the city noise and spend a few days alone in the wilderness. I wanted nothing more than to hike, camp, and live off the land for a short while, testing myself and my skills. I had gone over my checklist several times. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, first aid kit, compass, flashlight, and a small folding knife. Everything seemed perfect. I thought I was prepared. I thought I could handle anything. I was wrong. I drove for hours, leaving the main highways behind, following a dirt road that grew narrower and rougher the deeper I went. By the time I parked, I was miles away from the nearest town, far enough that cell service disappeared completely. I could see the dense forest stretching out in every direction, the trees tall and packed closely together, with the sun cutting slivers of light through the leaves. There was no one around for miles. No sound but the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional bird crying somewhere high above. It was beautiful, serene, and strangely isolating. I took a deep breath, feeling the city stress drain from my chest. The first day was perfect. I hiked through the trails I had mapped out, stopping occasionally to take photos or just sit and watch the river bend around the rocks. The air smelled clean, earthy, with hints of pine and damp soil. I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. Around noon, I found a clearing that seemed perfect for setting up camp. It was near a small stream that would provide water, and there were flat areas for my tent. I unpacked, set up my small tent, and built a fire pit with rocks I found nearby. By the time night fell, I had a small fire going and was cooking some canned beans over it. The stars above were brilliant, brighter than I had ever seen in the city, and I lay back for a moment just staring up, feeling at peace. It was around midnight when things began to change. I woke to a strange sound, a distant cracking of branches, almost like something was moving carefully through the forest. I sat up slowly, heart thumping, straining my ears. The sound stopped and started again, always just out of sight, always soft but deliberate. My first thought was that it was a deer or some small animal, but something about it didn't feel right. It wasn't random or chaotic like a normal animal moving. It was methodical, almost careful, like it knew I was there and was moving quietly around me. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that the darkness and silence were playing tricks on my mind, but the unease stayed with me. I huddled closer to the fire, letting the warmth soothe my nerves and trying to stay awake, thinking the morning would bring clarity. Sleep didn't come easy. Every rustle, every small sound made me tense. I kept imagining shadows moving just beyond the light of my fire. Hours passed slowly. The first light of dawn came, faint and gray, and I saw that there were small, fresh tracks circling my camp. Too big for a rabbit, too precise for deer, and shaped oddly. They weren't human at first glance, at least not like a normal shoe print, but there was a rough pattern, like someone had been circling my camp during the night. My stomach sank. I tried to reason through it. Maybe I had left something nearby that an animal had walked over? Maybe it was the wind? My mind searched for safe explanations, but every instinct screamed that I wasn't alone. I packed quickly that morning, trying to cover my tracks as best I could and avoid leaving evidence that I was here. The forest, which had seemed peaceful yesterday, now felt oppressive, alive with unseen eyes. I followed the trail I had come in on, moving faster than I had before, trying to get to the main road before anything else happened. Around mid-morning, I stopped for water at a stream, kneeling down and scooping it with my hands. That's when I noticed it. My heart dropped. There were more footprints on the bank, not random but following me, moving parallel to the stream. The spacing and shape matched what I had seen around my camp. My stomach twisted, and a sense of panic took hold. I ran through the forest, ignoring the trail I had planned to follow, just moving forward as fast as I could. Branches whipped my face, the underbrush scratched my arms, and the smell of wet earth and broken foliage filled my senses. I kept hearing them, the soft cracking of branches, always just behind me, though I never dared to look. Every time I slowed to catch my breath, the sound started again, drawing closer. I realized I had no idea what was following me, and the unknown terrified me more than any animal could. Hours passed. The sun rose high, and still, the forest seemed endless. My legs burned, my lungs were raw, and I knew I couldn't keep running forever. I finally found a small hollow in the forest, a place where the trees were thinner and the ground slightly higher. I crouched there, trying to make myself small and stay hidden, listening. The sounds had stopped, or maybe I had become too exhausted to notice them. I stayed there for hours, my mind spinning through possibilities. Could it have been another camper? Someone who didn't want me here? A hunter? The thought made me shiver. I had no idea. As night began to fall again, I realized I had to move. I had no supplies left, water was low, food was gone, and the first aid kit was nearly empty. My phone had no signal. I had to reach safety. I chose a direction at random, hoping it would lead me back to the road or a ranger station, and moved slowly, cautiously. Every small noise made me freeze. My imagination ran wild, picturing shapes in the trees, hearing whispers of movement in the dark. I couldn't see much in the failing light, only the shadows of the trees stretching long and foreboding across the forest floor. Then I heard it, a clear, human-like sound. Footsteps, deliberate, crunching over leaves and twigs. My heart slammed against my ribs. I ducked behind a tree, trying not to breathe, trying to disappear. The footsteps got closer. Then I heard a voice, though not words, just a shout that carried through the trees, followed by more movement. Someone was looking for me. The rational part of my mind screamed that I had to keep moving, but fear froze me. I waited until the footsteps receded slightly, then crawled low through the brush, careful not to make noise. It was hours of this, creeping through the forest like a hunted animal. Every step a risk. My body ached. My clothes were torn. My face scratched and bleeding from branches. Sleep was impossible. Hunger gnawed at me, my stomach in constant knots. And yet, I had to survive. I had no other choice. Finally, as the first hint of dawn appeared, I stumbled onto a small logging road. It was narrow and overgrown, but it was a road, and roads led to people. Relief washed over me. I ran along it, waving my arms, shouting, hoping someone would see me. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted a truck parked near a small cabin. A man emerged, clearly surprised to see me, but he called for me to stay calm and helped me into the vehicle. I couldn't stop shaking. I tried to explain, but words failed me. All I could do was sit, shivering, exhausted, and watch the trees behind me, knowing what had followed me for miles was gone but still out there. The man drove me back to the nearest ranger station, where I finally got help. They searched the area I had camped in, finding evidence of someone else moving through the forest. Footprints, signs of a makeshift camp, items I hadn't noticed before. Nothing violent, no injuries beyond the ones I had inflicted on myself by running. But the realization hit me. I had been watched, hunted, and alone. The feeling of being hunted didn't disappear quickly, but I felt safe again, surrounded by people and walls and locked doors. In the weeks after, I couldn't shake the memory of the forest. The way the shadows moved, the sound of footsteps just beyond sight, the way I had felt so powerless. I never went camping alone again. I never took the solitude of the wilderness for granted. I learned to respect it, to prepare for the unknown, and to never assume that being alone meant being safe. And though I returned to the forest eventually, I never forgot the fear of those long, endless hours, moving silently through trees, knowing something unknown had followed me and could have ended me at any moment. The story ends not with fantasy, not with a ghost or a monster, but with the stark reality of the wilderness. The unknown is real, human or animal, and survival depends on preparation, vigilance, and respect for the power of nature and the hidden dangers that can lurk behind every tree. I survived because of quick thinking, because of determination, because of luck. But the fear, the memory, it never left. I had been planning this solo camping trip for weeks, carefully choosing the right location, the right weather window, and packing all the essentials I could think of. I wanted a challenge, a way to disconnect from the constant hum of life in the city, to find something raw and untouched in the wilderness. The map I had studied showed a remote stretch of forest, a few miles off the nearest trailhead, with a small river winding through it. According to the reports I found online, it was seldom visited, and that was exactly what I wanted. I packed my backpack with food for 4 days, a tent, a sleeping bag, a first aid kit, water purification tablets, extra clothing, a compact stove, and a heavy-duty knife. I also carried a map and compass because I didn't trust GPS in that remote area. I arrived at the trailhead in the late morning, when the sun was high enough to light the forest canopy, but not so high that the temperature had begun to soar. I started walking with a confident stride, feeling the weight of the backpack on my shoulders, each step deliberate on the uneven ground. The trail was narrow, overgrown in places, and smelled damp from a recent rain. Birds called intermittently, insects buzzed in the underbrush, and the occasional rustle of small animals in the leaves reminded me that I was entering someone else's home. I kept track of the time and distance, trying not to get carried away with the beauty of the forest. Every so often, I would stop, check the map, and make sure I was following the correct bearings. By late afternoon, I was well past the main trail, and the forest was thick, with towering pine and oak trees blocking much of the sun. The air smelled earthy, the kind of rich, living smell you don't find in cities. My legs were tired from the constant uphill climbs and the uneven terrain, but I felt exhilarated. I began scouting for a campsite. I wanted a flat area near the river, but not too close in case of sudden rises in water levels. After some careful searching, I found a small clearing, surrounded by a ring of trees that would shield me from the wind. The ground was slightly soft, covered in fallen leaves and needles, perfect for driving tent stakes into. I unpacked my gear slowly, taking care to set up my tent so that it faced the river, giving me a clear view. I set up my small stove and boiled water for a meal, savoring the feeling of solitude and the sounds of nature around me. The sun began to dip lower, filtering through the canopy in golden shafts. Shadows grew long and the forest took on a more ominous appearance. I reminded myself that it was still early and there was plenty of daylight, but a quiet unease began to settle in my chest. I tried to shake it off, attributing it to the natural instinct of being alone in an unfamiliar environment. By the time the sky was painted with deep oranges and purples, I had finished eating and cleaned my cooking area. I decided to take a short walk along the river, hoping to get a better sense of the terrain and perhaps find some firewood for the evening. The river's current was steady, the water cold and clear. I stepped carefully on the stones near the bank, listening to the rush of the water over rocks. The forest around me was silent now except for the wind through the trees and the distant call of a crow. As I walked, I began to notice broken branches and flattened underbrush, signs that something large had passed through recently. My pulse quickened, and I reminded myself that it was most likely a deer or a bear, common in these forests. I carried my knife in one hand, not because I expected trouble, but because it gave me a small sense of security. I followed the river for a short distance before heading back to camp, making a mental note to keep food securely stored and to remain cautious. I returned to the campsite as dusk turned to night. The forest around me was now almost entirely dark, with only a sliver of moonlight illuminating the clearing. I lit a small fire, carefully contained in a ring of stones, and watched the flames dance. I made sure to keep my knife within reach and my backpack close, just in case. Night in the forest was different from anything I had experienced in the city. The sounds were amplified. Every crackle of a branch, every rustle of leaves seemed unnaturally loud. I felt both alive and exposed, a tiny human presence in a vast, indifferent wilderness. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that immediately put my senses on high alert. It was a low, heavy thud, repeated several times, followed by a dragging noise. My heart pounded in my chest, and I froze, straining my ears. The sound seemed to be coming from the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of my firelight. I stayed still, trying to determine what it was. The dragging stopped, replaced by a series of sharp snaps and rustling movements. I realized that whatever it was large and moving close to my camp. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? A wild boar? Or maybe a deer caught on something. I reminded myself to stay calm. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly aimed it toward the sound, sweeping the beam across the trees. The beam illuminated nothing at first, but then I caught a glimpse of movement. Something large was shifting behind the trees, tall and dark against the dim moonlight. My stomach sank. I knew I couldn't run blindly into the forest. I decided to retreat into my tent slowly, keeping the knife and flashlight ready. I moved as quietly as possible, aware that the sound of my footsteps could attract whatever was nearby. Once inside the tent, I unzipped just enough to peer out, listening. The thudding returned, closer now, accompanied by a wet, gurgling sound that made my stomach turn. My mind tried to rationalize it. A bear dragging its prey, perhaps, but the proximity and intensity made rational thought difficult. The sounds circled the camp. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch sent a jolt through my body. I stayed motionless, pretending I was part of the forest, hoping that remaining still would prevent detection. The firelight flickered, and I realized it was almost out. I knew I had to make a decision. Staying and hoping it would leave was dangerous, but so was venturing into the dark forest with limited visibility. After what felt like an eternity, I remembered a trick I had learned from survival guides. Noise and light can sometimes deter large animals. I grabbed a metal pot and banged it against a rock, creating a loud, echoing sound, and at the same time shone my flashlight in a wide sweep around the campsite. There was a pause, the thudding stopped, and I held my breath. Slowly, I saw the dark shape retreat, moving back toward the trees. I didn't wait to see more. I grabbed my backpack, stuffing essentials into it, extinguished the fire, and started moving slowly toward higher ground that I had scouted earlier, hoping to put more distance between myself and the creature. The forest was unforgiving. Every step required careful navigation over roots, rocks, and fallen branches. My legs burned, my lungs were tight, but I forced myself to keep going. The sounds of movement in the dark were constant. I couldn't tell if the creature was following or if it had returned to wherever it had come from, but I didn't take chances. Hours passed, or at least it felt like hours, before I reached a ridge I had noted from the map. From here, I could see a faint glimmer of distant lights, what I assumed was a road or some human habitation. Relief surged, but I knew I still had to be careful. I stayed at that ridge until first light, watching the forest below. I kept my knife ready, my senses alert, and my mind on high alert. When the sun finally began to rise, the forest revealed itself in a less threatening way, but the events of the night had left a lasting imprint on me. Exhausted and still tense, I followed the ridge path toward the faint lights, eventually finding a road. I made my way down to the road, where I was able to flag down a passing vehicle and arrange for a ride back to civilization. The experience left me shaken, but it also left me with a profound respect for the wilderness. It reminded me that even well-prepared, cautious humans are vulnerable in the natural world, and that awareness, patience, and calm decision-making are crucial. I had survived not because I was brave or lucky, but because I stayed alert, moved strategically, and never let fear cloud my judgment. The forest remained behind me, vast and indifferent, but I carried the lessons of that night forward, a constant reminder of the thin line between adventure and danger. From that day on, I never underestimated the forest. I learned to scout more carefully, to set up camp in less exposed areas, to always have a plan for retreat, and to respect the creatures that share the land with me. Every time I tell the story, I remember the weight of that night, the darkness that pressed in on all sides, and the slow, steady climb back to safety. I also remember the sunrise, the clarity of the ridge, and the relief that followed, knowing that I had survived by keeping my wits and respecting the wilderness. I had always thought of myself as someone who could handle the outdoors. The idea of camping alone had always appealed to me. The quiet, the solitude, the feeling of being completely on my own in the wilderness. I wanted to test my skills, my instincts, and my ability to survive without anyone else to rely on. The plan was simple. 1 week, deep in the backwoods of a national forest, far from the nearest road, far from cell service, and with nothing but my backpack, tent, and a few supplies. I had gone on day hikes before, some overnight trips, but this would be my longest and most isolated venture yet. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning, carrying my backpack, which was heavy but manageable. It contained a tent, sleeping bag, stove, canned food, water, a first aid kit, and some other essentials. The forest was dense, with tall pines and thick underbrush that pressed close to the trail. The air smelled of damp earth and pine sap. The ground was soft underfoot, covered in fallen needles and leaves, and the occasional snap of a twig made me flinch, reminding me that I was entering an environment that wasn't quite mine. The first day went smoothly. The trail was well marked, and I made decent progress. I had a map and a compass, but I liked to rely on my own sense of direction as much as possible. By late afternoon, I had found a small clearing near a creek, a perfect spot to set up camp. The water ran clear and cold, and I drank sparingly, knowing I could refill from the stream after boiling it. I pitched my tent, arranged my supplies, and prepared a small fire with dry sticks I collected from the forest floor. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I felt a small sense of triumph. That first night, the forest was alive with sound. Insects buzzed incessantly, frogs croaked near the creek, and the wind rustled the branches above. I tried to sleep, but every little sound seemed amplified in the darkness. My mind kept drifting to the idea that I was completely alone, with no one around to help if something went wrong. It was an unsettling feeling, but not entirely unpleasant. I eventually drifted into a light sleep, waking occasionally to the sounds of the night. The next few days were uneventful but demanding. The terrain grew rougher, and the trail disappeared in places, forcing me to navigate by landmarks and compass bearings. My legs ached constantly, my backpack felt heavier with each step, and I learned to ration my food and water carefully. I made notes in a small journal, recording the types of plants I saw, the tracks of animals in the mud, and the subtle changes in the weather. I felt self-sufficient, confident in my ability to survive. But on the fourth day, things began to feel different. I had decided to push further into the forest, past where I knew any other campers or hikers would venture. The trees grew closer together, the underbrush thicker, and the trail harder to follow. At first, I felt exhilaration at the challenge. But as evening approached, I realized I had lost the trail completely. I tried retracing my steps, but the forest all looked the same, and shadows lengthened rapidly, making it harder to distinguish landmarks. I knew I needed to find a spot to camp before darkness fell completely. I stumbled upon a small flat area near a shallow ravine. The ground was uneven, but it was the only place I could set up my tent. I worked quickly, setting up my shelter and gathering dry sticks for a fire. The air felt colder than usual, and I shivered, despite my jacket. I lit the fire and sat close, trying to calm myself. My mind was on high alert, and I felt a creeping anxiety I had never felt before in the forest. As night fell, the forest became almost suffocatingly quiet. There was no breeze, no distant bird calls, no rustle of leaves. Even the creek seemed to vanish, as though the world itself had retreated into darkness. I tried to eat my dinner, but my appetite had vanished. I kept listening, straining for any sound, any hint that I was not alone. Then I heard it. A faint rustling in the underbrush, coming from the edge of my small clearing. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer or a raccoon, but the sound was deliberate, slow, and calculated, not random like the movements of forest creatures. I froze, staring into the shadows. The fire crackled, casting long, jittering shapes across the trees. The rustling grew closer, and then stopped abruptly. My heart pounded. I considered leaving the tent and walking into the dark to confront whatever it was, but the rational part of my mind warned me that it could be dangerous. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the darkness, sweeping it slowly across the trees. Nothing, just darkness and the empty forest. I tried to sleep, but every rustle, every snapping twig, made me jump. I kept my knife close, my backpack ready, my mind racing through every worst-case scenario. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a bear or a large raccoon, curious about my fire and my food. But even that explanation didn't completely calm me. In the middle of the night, I heard something else. Footsteps. Soft, slow, deliberate steps moving along the perimeter of my small clearing. My stomach dropped. This was no animal. I stayed completely still, breathing shallowly, straining to hear the sounds over the pounding of my own heart. The steps continued, circling my tent, stopping occasionally, then moving again. I considered screaming, but I knew that could provoke whoever or whatever it was. I gripped my flashlight and knife, trying to make myself ready for anything. Hours seemed to pass, though it might have only been minutes. Finally, the sounds receded, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The morning light was a relief. I broke camp as quickly as I could, keeping my movements quiet but deliberate. My hands shook as I packed, and every shadow seemed to move unnaturally. I decided to stick to a general direction I knew would eventually lead me back to a main trail, hoping to get out of this part of the forest as soon as possible. The next day was a grueling march. My nerves were frayed, and every sound made me tense. I saw the signs of wildlife, tracks, broken branches, droppings, but nothing approached me. I kept reminding myself to stay calm, to think clearly. I rationed my water carefully, taking small sips at intervals. My legs were sore, and the blisters on my feet were growing. The forest seemed endless, an oppressive wall of green and brown that offered no sign of escape. By the third day of being lost, my situation had become dire. My food was almost gone, and I had limited water. The sun had shifted, and I tried to use it to orient myself. I realized I had wandered far from any recognizable landmarks. Panic began to creep in. I tried not to let it take over, focusing instead on survival strategies I had learned over the years. Finding water, finding safe places to rest, conserving energy. That night, I found a small rock overhang that offered minimal shelter. I collected what little firewood I could and built a tiny fire. I ate the last of my food, drinking sparingly. As I lay next to the fire, I heard movement again. This time it was far away, but unmistakable voices. Distant, muffled human voices. I froze, trying to determine the direction. They weren't loud, but they carried in the still night air. Relief and fear mingled in me. Relief that there might be other humans nearby. Fear because I didn't know if they were friendly. I stayed low, keeping my fire small and minimal. Over the next few hours, the voices grew louder as they moved closer. I stayed hidden, crouched behind a boulder, watching shadows pass. Eventually, the people, hikers it seemed, came into view. I waited until they had passed before cautiously following their trail the next morning. I trailed them at a safe distance, careful not to be seen. By mid-afternoon, I found a clearer trail and finally emerged onto a dirt road that led to the main part of the forest. Exhausted, dehydrated, and terrified, I walked until I reached the ranger station. I collapsed in front of the ranger, explaining as best I could that I had been lost for days. They gave me water, food, and medical attention. I later learned that the part of the forest I had wandered into was notorious for confusing even experienced hikers. Many people had gotten lost there, some for days, some permanently. In the end, I was okay physically, though mentally, the experience left a mark. I realized how quickly confidence can turn into fear in the wilderness, how small mistakes, losing the trail, underestimating the environment, can escalate into life-threatening situations. I learned to respect the forest, to prepare more thoroughly, and never to underestimate how unpredictable isolation can feel. I never went camping alone like that again, but I didn't let fear stop me from enjoying the outdoors. Instead, I became more careful, more aware, and more humble. It took weeks to shake the feeling of being watched, the lingering tension of those nights in the backwoods. But eventually, the memories became lessons. I learned that survival wasn't about bravado or daring. It was about preparation, observation, patience, and respect. I still think about that week, the night spent shivering under the stars, listening to footsteps that might have been animals or might have been something else entirely. And I know now that the forest is beautiful, but it is not forgiving. It has its rules, and those who enter it must follow them. The experience changed me. I still hike, I still camp, but never without thorough planning and an awareness that the world outside civilization is not kind or predictable. I learned the hard way that nature, though stunning and liberating, can also be indifferent and dangerous. And that is a lesson I carry with me every time I step into the wild. I had been planning the trip for months. I wanted to go deep into the forest, far from any roads or towns, somewhere I could truly be alone, surrounded only by nature. I had done camping before, but nothing like this. I picked a site recommended in an old guidebook I found at a small bookstore in town. The author promised a quiet, isolated stretch of forest with a small clearing near a stream. No trails, no other campers, nothing but trees, rocks, and the wild. I felt confident. I had my gear: a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for low temperatures, a backpack with enough food for 3 days, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, and a small but reliable knife. I even brought a lightweight stove. I wanted to feel prepared. The drive there took hours. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the hills when I reached the end of the road. The forest ahead was dense, dark, and silent in a way that made my stomach tighten. I parked, grabbed my pack, and began the hike. The ground was uneven, the underbrush thick, branches scraping against my arms and legs. I walked for over an hour, following a vague path marked only by subtle breaks in the trees and the distant sound of running water. As the light faded, the forest grew colder, and shadows lengthened, turning the familiar shapes of trees into jagged, twisting forms. Finally, I found the clearing. It was smaller than I expected, a flat area surrounded by tall pines, with a narrow stream running along one edge. I set up my tent near the water, careful to stay a little higher to avoid any unexpected rise in the stream. The air smelled of wet earth and pine needles, and the only sounds were the rushing water and the occasional crack of a distant branch under a hidden animal's weight. I started a small fire with the dry wood I had gathered, using my lighter and patience. Flames licked at the kindling, and I felt a sense of satisfaction as the warmth pushed back the chill of the evening. Night fell fast, the temperature dropped, and I bundled into my sleeping bag, listening to the forest's subtle noises. At first, it was comforting: the rustle of leaves, the occasional splash in the stream, the soft wind through the trees. But after a while, the sounds became sharper, more deliberate. I thought I heard footsteps on the path I had walked, breaking twigs in a pattern too steady to be a random animal. My heart began to race. I told myself it was impossible. I was alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely by myself. I reached for my flashlight and shined it across the clearing. Shadows stretched and shifted in the corners of the trees, but I saw nothing. Sleep came slowly. I dreamt of being watched. Every rustle of the leaves in my dream felt like someone moving closer. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of something crashing through the underbrush near the stream. My eyes snapped open, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I stayed still, listening. The noise stopped. I strained to hear over the pounding of my own heartbeat, the fear pressing against my chest. It was quiet again, but now the silence itself felt heavy, almost tangible. I tried to rationalize it. A deer? Maybe. or a bear sniffing around. I had food, but I was careful to keep it in a sealed container away from the tent. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was had been watching me. I forced myself to sleep again, though fitfully. Morning came with a pale, gray light filtering through the pines. The forest seemed different in daylight, less threatening, though still remote and imposing. I ate a quick breakfast and considered my options. I wanted to stay another day to explore the stream and the small rise I had noticed nearby. I told myself that the night had been paranoia, that the forest was just a place full of sounds that I wasn't used to. That morning, I hiked along the stream, noting the different bird calls and the way the sunlight hit the water. It was beautiful, serene even, and for a few hours I felt at peace. I even laughed quietly at my own fear the previous night, thinking I had let my imagination run wild. But the peace didn't last. Around midday, as I made my way back to the tent, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Broken branches on the path I had taken the day before, shallow footprints in the soft earth, too large to be human, but not quite the right shape for deer. My stomach dropped. I knelt and studied them, tracing the edges with my finger. They were recent. I returned to my tent quickly, my nerves on edge. I double-checked the food, secured everything inside my backpack, and sat by the stream, trying to calm myself. I knew it could have been a wild animal, maybe a bear or a large boar. Both were known to inhabit this forest. Still, the prints made me uneasy. They weren't deep, like a heavy animal walking through soft soil. They seemed deliberate, careful, almost like the creature was aware of my presence. By evening, the tension had returned fully. The fire crackled weakly, shadows moving unnaturally across the clearing. I heard the snapping of twigs again, closer this time, and a low growl from somewhere in the underbrush. I grabbed my knife, the cold steel feeling reassuring in my hand. The sound circled the clearing, moving with a strange awareness. It wasn't running, it was stalking. My body was rigid, every sense on high alert. I stayed perfectly still, eyes darting, waiting. Hours seemed to stretch endlessly. Every shadow could hide the source of the sound. Suddenly, I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. A large black shape, low to the ground, moving with careful stealth. My pulse raced as I realized it was massive, larger than any deer, with a powerful, muscular frame. A bear. A black bear, its head low, eyes gleaming in the firelight. I froze. Bears usually avoid humans, but this one was not fleeing. It was watching, calculating. My mind raced. I remembered everything I had read. Do not run, make yourself look big, slowly back away if necessary. But the fire was low, and I knew I couldn't stay exposed. I backed slowly toward my tent, keeping my eyes on the bear. Followed a few steps, then paused. My hands shook as I reached for the bear spray I had brought. Thankfully, I had remembered it. I fumbled with the canister, heart hammering, and readied myself. The bear moved again, closer, nostrils flaring, sniffing the air. I sprayed a sudden burst toward its face. The bear reared back, shook its head, growled, then turned and ran back into the trees. I exhaled in relief, my body trembling uncontrollably. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening for any sign of its return. Every sound made me jump. The forest seemed alive in a way I hadn't noticed before. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, every splash of water felt threatening. I barely slept, only dozing lightly between bursts of anxiety. Morning came slowly, gray and quiet. I packed everything carefully, leaving no trace of food or scent, and began the hike back to my car. Every step was tense. I didn't dare look behind me. The forest seemed different now, more menacing, as if it had tested me and found me lacking in some way. Hours later, I finally broke through the trees onto the road. Relief hit me like a wave. I was safe. I was tired, shaken, but safe. I stopped by a small stream along the road to wash my face and hands. As I looked at my reflection in the water, I realized something important. I had underestimated the forest. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also wild and unpredictable. I had thought myself prepared, but reality had reminded me that nature is not a backdrop for adventure. It is an entire world with its own rules, and it will not bend for human expectations. I drove home slowly, replaying every detail in my mind. The bear, the footprints, the snapping twigs at night, the silence that felt alive. It had all been real. I knew I had been lucky. The experience left a lasting mark. I felt gratitude for my careful preparation, for the small tools that had protected me, but also respect for the sheer unpredictability of the wild. It was a humbling lesson, one I would never forget. At home, I unpacked my gear, inspected everything carefully, and cleaned my knife. I took a long shower, the hot water washing away the grime, but not the memory. I knew that my decision to return to civilization had been the right one. The forest had not been a place for comfort or safety. It had been a test of vigilance, patience, and respect. I felt a deep sense of relief and accomplishment. I had survived, unhurt, and with all my wits intact. I wrote down the details in a notebook that night, describing the campsite, the bear, the footsteps, every sound I had heard, every movement I had made. I wanted to remember it all, not just as a story, but as a record of what it meant to be truly alone in the wilderness. It was a story of caution, of preparedness, of understanding that even the most peaceful-looking places can hide danger. In the following days, I reflected often on the experience. I understood something vital. Fear in the forest is real, but it is manageable if you respect it, if you stay aware, and if you never let yourself forget that you are not in control. I planned future trips more carefully, but I also carried a renewed sense of respect for the wild. It had tested me, and I had passed, not through luck alone, but through preparation, observation, and the willingness to face fear directly. The story of that trip remains vivid in my mind, a memory etched with every detail of the forest. The scent of wet pine, the rush of the stream, the tension of the night, the immense, black shape of the bear. It was terrifying, but it was also a triumph of endurance and awareness. I survived because I respected the rules of the wilderness and acted with caution, and that knowledge has stayed with me, shaping every adventure I have undertaken since. The forest is never tame, and it never promises safety. But if you enter it with preparation, patience, and respect, you can navigate its dangers and emerge with not only your life but also a story to tell. A story that reminds you of the raw, uncompromising beauty of the world beyond human civilization. I had planned this camping trip for months, trying to escape the stress of work and the endless noise of the city. I wanted to spend a few days completely alone in the wilderness, just me and the trees, the sky, and the rivers. I had been hiking and camping before, but this trip was going to be different. I chose a trail I had read about online, somewhere in a large national forest that was not very popular. I liked the idea of solitude, of not seeing another person for days. I packed carefully, taking more supplies than I would normally need, and made sure my gear was in top shape. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, enough food for 4 days, water filter, extra clothes, a first aid kit, and a fully charged phone with a backup power bank. I even took a small hand axe and a compact shovel just in case. The drive to the trailhead was long. I left before dawn, wanting to reach the forest when it was still quiet. The sun was just rising over the hills when I parked my car. The parking area was small and I was the only one there. I double-checked my backpack, adjusted the straps, and started walking. The path was steep at first, winding through thick trees and overgrown bushes. The ground was damp from last night's rain, and every step made a soft squelching sound as my boots sank into the mud. I felt a sense of calm as I walked, the way the forest blocked out the sounds of the outside world, replacing them with birds, wind through leaves, and the distant gurgle of a stream. By midday, I had reached a clearing I thought would be a good spot to set up camp. It was near a small creek that trickled over rocks, making a soft, constant noise that was soothing. I laid down my gear, stretched my back, and began pitching the tent. The ground was uneven, but I managed to find a spot that was flat enough. I hammered the stakes carefully, making sure the tent would stay secure in case of wind or rain. Once it was up, I unpacked my sleeping bag and organized my food and equipment. After setting up camp, I explored the area around me. The forest was dense, with tall pines and thick underbrush. There were fallen logs covered in moss, and the smell of wet earth filled the air. I followed the creek upstream, watching the water wind around rocks and fallen branches. I noticed small animal tracks in the mud, raccoons, deer, and maybe a fox. It made me feel alive, connected to the forest in a way that I never did in the city. I even spotted a hawk circling overhead, its sharp eyes scanning the ground. As the day went on, I returned to my campsite, collected some firewood, and built a small fire pit. I carefully arranged the stones I found nearby, making sure the fire wouldn't spread. I like to be cautious. Fires in the forest could be dangerous. As night fell, the forest changed completely. The temperature dropped quickly, and the shadows of the trees stretched across the clearing like long fingers. I lit a fire and sat beside it, eating a simple meal of beans and rice I had heated on my small camping stove. The crackle of the fire was comforting, but the forest was alive with sounds I hadn't noticed during the day. The rustling of leaves, the snap of a branch in the distance, and the occasional call of a night bird made me hyper-aware of every movement. I reminded myself that these were all natural sounds, animals going about their lives. Still, being alone made them feel sharper, more immediate. I had planned to sleep early, but I found myself lying in my sleeping bag, staring up at the dark canopy of trees above my tent. The sky was barely visible through the branches, but I could see a few stars. The fire had burned down to embers, and I could hear the creek nearby. It was peaceful, but I felt an edge of tension that I couldn't shake. I tried to sleep, but every little sound made me tense. A branch snapped somewhere close, and I sat up, listening. My mind raced through possibilities: deer, raccoon, maybe even a bear. I had read about black bears in the area. I reassured myself that my food was packed securely and away from the tent. After a while, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night. Something had made a noise close to the tent, soft, scraping sounds, like something moving over the fallen leaves. My heart raced as I strained to see in the darkness. The flashlight was in my backpack, but I didn't want to move yet. I listened, holding my breath. The noise continued for several minutes, circling my tent. My mind tried to reason. A raccoon, maybe a deer, small animals that couldn't hurt me. But part of me knew that larger predators could be nearby, watching, waiting. I had read about people being attacked by black bears while camping. My stomach tightened, and my hands shook slightly. I waited until the noise faded, telling myself I had imagined it. When I finally reached for my flashlight, I moved slowly, keeping my breathing low. I turned it on and scanned the area around the tent. Nothing moved. I got up carefully, grabbing my small hand axe and keeping it in front of me. I checked the fire pit. No signs of anyone or anything. I went to my backpack and double-checked that my food was securely packed in the bear-proof container I had brought. The rest of the night passed without incident, though I barely slept. Every sound made me tense, and I found myself listening to the forest as if my life depended on it. The next morning, I decided to explore further, trying to put the previous night out of my mind. I followed the creek downstream, keeping an eye out for wildlife. The forest was beautiful, with moss-covered rocks, fallen logs, and sunlight streaming through the trees. I even saw a deer grazing near the creek before it noticed me and bounded away. I took pictures with my phone, though I mostly wanted to remember the feeling of being in the forest, the quiet, and the isolation. Around midday, I decided to hike up a small ridge I had noticed the day before. The path was steep, and I had to use my hands to steady myself on some rocks. My boots slipped on wet leaves, and I moved slowly, carefully testing each step. The ridge gave me a view of the surrounding forest, and I could see my campsite far below, the smoke from the fire pit just a thin wisp in the distance. I felt a thrill at the height, a sense of freedom that came from being far from anything man-made. As I started to descend, I realized that the path was more treacherous than I had thought. Loose rocks and mud made footing uncertain. I tried to be careful, but my foot slipped on a wet stone, and I twisted my ankle. Pain shot through my leg, and I had to sit for a moment to steady myself. I could still walk, though with difficulty. I decided to head back to camp slowly, leaning on my hand axe for balance. By the time I reached the clearing, my ankle was swollen and bruised. I sat by the fire pit, thinking about my options. I knew I could still hike out if necessary, but it would be painful and slow. I applied a makeshift bandage with my first aid kit and rested my ankle. That evening, I was extra cautious. I kept the fire burning brighter than before and arranged rocks around it to make it safer. I ate a small meal, and then I sat, staring into the flames, listening to the forest. The wind rustled through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, I heard a deep growl. My heart jumped. I froze, listening. The growl came again, closer this time. It was low and guttural, not the sound of a deer or a raccoon. I knew immediately what it was. A black bear. My mind raced. I stayed still, remembering everything I had read about bear encounters. I kept my hands visible, my small hand axe close. I did not run. Bears are more likely to chase if you run. The bear circled the clearing. I could hear it sniffing the air, moving through the underbrush. I stayed calm, breathing slowly, making myself look as non-threatening as possible. My fire helped, I hoped. I remembered that making noise could sometimes scare bears away, but I didn't want to provoke it. For what felt like hours, the bear stayed nearby, its heavy breathing audible, its claws scratching the ground. I stayed in my sleeping bag, using it as cover while keeping my flashlight handy. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, the bear moved away. I waited a long time before I dared to move, and then I carefully checked the area. The bear had gone, but the tracks around my tent were a grim reminder of how close it had been. The next morning, I made the decision to leave. My ankle was still sore, and the bear encounter had shaken me. I packed up my tent slowly, making sure I didn't leave anything behind that could attract another animal. I moved cautiously down the trail, stepping carefully on loose rocks and mud. Every noise made me jump. By midday, I reached the parking area. My car was exactly where I had left it, and I felt a huge sense of relief. I got inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. The drive back to the city was long, but I felt different than when I had arrived. The forest had tested me, had forced me to confront fear in a way I never had before. I realized that being in the wilderness alone was not just about solitude. It was about respect for nature and understanding that even a small mistake could have serious consequences. I promised myself I would return one day, but next time I would be better prepared, more cautious, and more aware of my surroundings. The memory of the bear, the twisting ankle, and the endless night in the dark forest stayed with me. But it became a story I could tell myself without panic, a lesson in survival and patience. By the time I reached my apartment, I was exhausted but grateful. I unpacked my gear, checked everything, and cleaned my boots. I felt stronger, more careful, and more connected to the world outside the city. That camping trip had been frightening, yes, but it had also been enlightening. I had faced real danger, real fear, and had come out the other side alive and wiser. I realized that fear is not something to avoid. It is something to respect, to learn from. And in that forest, alone with the trees, the creek, and a bear, I had learned a lot about myself. I had been planning this camping trip for months, carefully picking a spot deep in the forest far from any town or main road. I wanted to escape everything: traffic, noise, people. The kind of trip where it was just me, my gear, and the woods. I knew the forest I chose was known for being remote, dense, and largely untouched by modern life, and that was exactly what I wanted. I packed my backpack with the usual essentials: tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, water, and a small first aid kit. I also carried a compass, a map of the area, and a flashlight, though I hoped I would rely mostly on the sun to guide me. I left my phone behind. I wanted to disconnect completely. The drive to the forest was long, winding through miles of empty country roads and past abandoned fields where tall grass moved in strange, hypnotic patterns in the wind. By the time I reached the last point where my car could go, the sun was already low, and shadows stretched across the forest floor like fingers. I parked on a dirt track that ended abruptly at a narrow clearing. From there, I slung my backpack over my shoulder and followed a barely visible path into the woods. The air was cool and damp, filled with the earthy smell of soil and decaying leaves. Birds called in the distance, and I could hear the occasional snap of twigs under the weight of small animals moving through the brush. I walked for what felt like hours, but I knew from the map that I was close to a small clearing by a stream, which I had planned to make my campsite. I moved carefully, stepping over roots and rocks, trying not to make too much noise. The forest grew denser as I went, and soon the sunlight barely reached the forest floor. Every step was accompanied by the sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant drumming of woodpeckers, the occasional rustle of small animals. It was peaceful, almost hypnotic, but there was a quiet tension under it all, a sense that I was far from anything familiar. When I finally reached the clearing, it was smaller than I expected. The stream ran along one edge, narrow but fast-moving, and a few flat rocks near the water made it easy to fill my water bottle. I chose a spot slightly uphill from the stream to set up my tent, hoping to stay dry if the water level rose overnight. The ground was soft but firm, covered in a layer of fallen leaves and pine needles. I set up my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and arranged my gear neatly inside. I built a small fire pit out of stones I found nearby, careful to clear away all dry leaves around it. Once the fire was going, I cooked some food, the smell of sizzling meat filling the air. I ate slowly, enjoying the quiet, the isolation, and the natural beauty around me. As night fell, the forest changed. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and the sounds sharper. The wind whispered through the trees, and I could hear the stream moving faster in the darkness. My fire crackled, casting a warm glow over the clearing, but it didn't reach far. Beyond the light, the forest was a black wall. I finished eating and cleaned up, putting everything away carefully to avoid attracting animals. Then I climbed into my sleeping bag, zipped up the tent, and tried to rest. Sleep came in fits and starts. I kept waking up, hearing noises outside the tent. At first, I thought it was just the usual sounds of a forest at night. The rustling of leaves, small animals moving around, the occasional hoot of an owl. But then I started noticing patterns. There were snaps of branches that didn't sound like small animals. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving just beyond the clearing. I held my breath, trying to listen, straining my ears in the darkness. Each time I convinced myself it was nothing, but the feeling didn't go away. Something was out there, moving, watching. I stayed inside the tent, trying not to make any sound. The fire had burned low, and I could barely see through the fabric, only hearing the faint sounds outside. The steps seemed to move closer, then pause, then retreat slightly. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew I had to stay calm, but every instinct screamed at me to run. I reminded myself that I had a backpack with supplies, that I knew the forest, and that I could survive if needed. I tried to focus on the stream, listening to its constant movement, using it as a point of reference, but the tension in my body made it impossible to relax. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. The forest went silent, and I drifted back into a restless sleep. Morning came slowly, the light pale and weak through the thick canopy. I unzipped the tent cautiously, scanning the clearing. Nothing seemed out of place at first. The fire pit was intact, my gear untouched. I stepped out carefully, still alert, and checked the perimeter. There were no signs of anyone human, but I noticed something I hadn't seen before: faint tracks in the mud near the stream. They were large, uneven, and looked like they could belong to a person, but they didn't match any normal shoe pattern. I followed them cautiously for a few feet. They stopped abruptly at the edge of the forest. I spent the day on edge. I moved slowly, gathering firewood and exploring a bit of the surrounding area while keeping my campsite in sight. I tried to ignore the feeling of being watched, but it lingered, a constant prickling on the back of my neck. The sun was high, but the forest still felt enclosed, claustrophobic. I filled my water bottles from the stream, cooked some more food, and tried to stay busy. But every sound, a twig snapping, a bird taking flight, made me freeze and listen. That night was worse. The darkness seemed thicker, heavier, pressing down on me. I could hear movement all around, faint rustles and snaps, too deliberate to be just animals. I stayed inside the tent, clutching a large branch I had sharpened as a makeshift weapon. Hours passed slowly. The steps returned, circling the clearing, sometimes closer, sometimes further away. At one point, I could hear heavy breathing, muffled but unmistakable, just beyond the edge of the firelight. My stomach churned, fear and adrenaline mixing into a nauseating cocktail. I stayed perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. Eventually, the breathing stopped. The forest grew silent again. I stayed awake until the first light, unwilling to risk sleep. When dawn came, I unzipped the tent slowly, peering outside. The clearing was empty, no tracks except for the faint ones near the stream from yesterday. I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. I decided I had had enough. I packed my gear quickly but carefully, making sure nothing was left behind. I filled my water bottles, checked my map, and began the hike back to my car, staying alert and moving quickly but quietly through the forest. As I walked, I realized how easy it would have been for someone to approach me at night, to catch me unaware. The forest, beautiful as it was, had hidden dangers I hadn't considered. People who might wander into remote areas, who might not have good intentions. The isolation I had craved also made me vulnerable. I stayed on high alert, scanning every movement, every shadow. The path back felt longer than the one coming in, my pace quick but cautious. When I finally reached the dirt track where I had parked my car, relief washed over me. The sunlight was stronger here, and the forest behind me felt less oppressive from this distance. I locked the car, put my backpack inside, and sat for a moment, breathing deeply, letting the tension leave my body. I realized I had learned something important. The wilderness is beautiful, but it is unpredictable and, at times, dangerous. Not because of the supernatural, but because of real, tangible threats, both from nature and from other humans. I drove home slowly, stopping a few times to rest, my mind replaying every sound, every movement from the nights in the forest. I kept thinking about the tracks, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched. But I also thought about how I had stayed calm, how I had survived, and how I had learned to trust my instincts. By the time I reached the city, the tension had eased, replaced by a mix of exhaustion and relief. That trip stayed with me. I never went back to that exact forest, but I continued camping in other areas, always cautious, always prepared. I made sure I had better safety equipment, told someone my plans every time, and stayed alert to the reality that the woods can hide people as well as animals, and that isolation can be dangerous in ways I had never considered before. I realized that fear is natural, but preparation, vigilance, and respect for the environment and its unpredictability are what truly keep you safe. That camping trip had been terrifying, but it had also taught me the importance of awareness and caution. It reminded me that being alone in the wilderness is not just about enjoying the beauty. It's about understanding it, and respecting the fact that it can be unforgiving if you are not careful. I left the forest that day shaken but alive, and I carried that lesson with me every time I returned to the woods. I had faced real fear, survived it, and come out stronger and wiser for it.